Good afternoon. Thanks to all of you for joining. My name is Arne Jacobson. I'm director of the Schatz Energy Research Center at Cal Poly Humboldt, and really pleased to introduce today's webinar, which is titled Understanding Opportunities to Detect Ghost Gear and Secondary Entanglements in the Context of California Floating Offshore Wind. Before we dive in, just wanted to let people know that this presentation is a production of the Pacific Offshore Wind Consortium, or POWSI. Maybe next slide, yep. And so this is part of a webinar, an ongoing webinar series. Next slide. POWSI is a university-led partnership between the Schatz Energy Research Center at Cal Poly Humboldt, the Center for Coastal Marine Sciences at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, and the Pacific Marine Energy Center at Oregon State University. Just a few housekeeping items as we proceed. Today's webinar is being recorded and we'll make it available online through the Schatz Center's YouTube channel, and we'll also post the video to the Pacific Offshore Wind Consortium's website. Ideally, we'll get that done by next week. At least that's our target. If you have technical difficulties accessing any of the information associated with the webinar today, please post into the chat box, and we'll do our best to help you resolve that issue. Today's webinar will be, or presentation will be followed by a Q&A discussion. So if you'd like to ask a question, please use the Q&A box, not to be confused with the chat box. At the bottom of your screen, you can put in questions at any time, and then we'll compile them and do our best to answer questions during the Q&A period towards the end of the session. So without any further ado, let's start. And I'll just start by noting the project team for this overall effort. This is all based on a project that is sponsored by the California Energy Commission, and we're really grateful for that support. We've listed members of the Schatz Center project team. The project is led by the Schatz Center in partnership with Pacific Northwest National Laboratories, Morro, H.D. Harvey and Associates, Principal Power, and ABS, which is the American Bureau of Shipping. And some of the key members of our project partner teams are listed here on this slide as well. And really pleased to be working with such a strong team. In terms of today's session, we are just now finishing up the welcome, and so then we'll then proceed to a brief background on offshore wind and the project context, which I will present. I'll then pass it over to colleagues from our team to provide a project overview. We'll talk about some of the simulation modeling associated with this project and associated learnings. And we'll then present about a detection algorithm development effort. So it's essentially an algorithm for detecting whether or not entanglement events or gear stuck on a mooring line events have taken place. And then that will be followed by Q&A and discussion. Next slide. So just basic setting the scene. Some of this information may be very familiar to some of you, but just want to bring everybody up to the same speed. The Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, it's a federal agency, as part of the Department of Interior, held a lease auction for wind energy areas off the California coast in late 2022 that resulted in 2 lease blocks in northern off the coast of Northern California, the Humboldt wind energy area, and 3 lease blocks off the Central Coast. in the Morro Bay wind energy area. And so these are the areas that we thought about in terms of study areas for this analysis. We'll note that the global offshore wind industry is one that has been around for a couple of decades, with most deployments taking place in Europe, especially in the North Sea. There are also a number of locations in Asia, and some projects that have been developed, particularly in the last few years, but dating back in some cases almost a decade on the U.S. East Coast. But to date, there hasn't been development of offshore wind farms on the West Coast. California's operating environment for offshore wind differs significantly from some of these other locations where projects have taken place, and that affects the deployment strategies that can be used. They have to be appropriate for the site conditions. Next slide. And one of the biggest issues there just has to do with depth. The water depths along the coast offshore from California are considerably deeper than in some areas where offshore wind has been developed. Most of the North Sea and projects that have been developed on the U.S. East Coast, for example, have utilized fixed foundation offshore wind technology, which can take place in waters that are less than 60 meters depth. In deeper water, floating systems are required, and that would be the case on the U.S. West Coast advance. Yeah, this map gives us a sense of water depth in some of the areas where offshore wind development has occurred, including the North Sea area and the U.S. East Coast, where water is considerably shallower than areas along the West Coast that have been considered for offshore wind. So hence the difference in technology. Next. Floating offshore wind systems involve very large structures, and in some ways, unless you've worked with them directly or seen them directly, it can be hard to visualize the size of these structures and their scale. But they're very large systems. We've shown a humpback whale here, which comes out as just a little dot in the system to give some sense of scale, although not everything in this diagram is exactly to scale. And we're showing the mooring lines that would run down to the seafloor in this diagram, along with an inter-array electrical cable that would connect one turbine to another. So that's some of the infrastructure that would be involved. Next slide. In addition, in the context of a wind farm, you would have multiple turbines. You would have those turbines would be connected with each other to allow power to flow between the turbines through inter-array electrical cables, and then power from multiple turbines would be aggregated and delivered to an offshore substation, and then from the substation, power would be exported to shore via subsea cables. And in this context, in the context of the pictures that are being shown, these are fixed foundation wind turbines and substations. But what would be required on the West Coast would be floating systems, and in that context, what are known as dynamic cables would be required. Cables that are able to deal with the motion of the platform and would be able to deal with all of that flexing and movement. I guess just one other note, which is that all existing offshore wind farms utilize fixed foundation substations, and system offshore from California would likely require a floating substation, and these are not yet commercially available, although some work has been done in terms of design and conceptualizing what they would look like. So all of that floating infrastructure would require mooring, and so the potential for entanglement in relationship to the mooring for both the wind turbines and the substations would be something that would be relevant to some of the analysis we're doing in this project. Next slide. So in terms of this particular project, it's in response to concern that had been raised in a number of conversations and public comment periods regarding the potential for marine life entanglement in relationship to mooring lines on offshore wind-related infrastructure. We saw an opportunity when the California Energy Commission put out a call for proposals under GFO 22-401, which was advancing offshore wind monitoring technologies for floating offshore wind. We ended up proposing a novel approach for investigating a system to detect mooring line entanglement hazards and entanglement events, and were awarded a grant to pursue that work in the third quarter of 2023. Next slide. And as I mentioned earlier, this the coalition that is working on this consists of the Schatz Center and our partners. Our team at the Schatz Center has specialization in mechanical and naval engineering of moored subsea infrastructure, and we're also supported by quite a bit of capability related to numerical or computational modeling and signal analysis. We also have expertise in platform dynamics and oceanographic processes applied to floating offshore wind systems, and are able to apply that expertise in complex mid-ocean conditions. We're supported in that effort by a set of collaborators, next slide, including Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, which provides sensor system engineering and model testing capabilities. MARE, which is Marine Applied Research and Exploration, has expertise in ROV development and testing and system integration. So these are ROVs are remotely operated undersea vessels. H.T. Harvey and Associates is a team member. They've now recently been acquired by Integral Consulting, but we've kept the H.T. Harvey and Associates branding here just for continuity. They provide ecological expertise and guidance related to the analysis that we're conducting. Principal Power is a floating platform developer, and they have provided modeling feedback, industry experience, assessment of what actually could be feasible for deployment or integration into a working system, and have been great collaborators in that regard. And the American Bureau of Shipping has provided or is providing technology review and input. And at the end of the project, one of the goals is for them to issue a new technology qualification statement as of the system that ends up getting developed through or the technology concepts that get developed through this project. And with that, I will pass things over to my colleague Greyson Adams to go over the goals, objectives, and inputs of the project.
Great. Thank you so much, Arne. And thank you everyone for being here today. We're excited to share the developments and findings from our research project with you all. So again, my name is Greyson Adams. I'm a senior research scientist here at the Schatz Center and serving as the project manager for this project. And today I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the goals, objectives, and then inputs that went into our project. Arne mentioned this when he went over sort of conceptually and contextually what we're doing here today. But the goal of our project is to really understand the dynamics and the detectability of options that are potentially available to us to be able to detect floating debris when it becomes caught on an offshore wind system. Um, Both the areas, the Humboldt area and the Morro Bay wind energy areas, are offshore in areas that are currently basically bereft of development. And so the idea of putting many large semi-submersible or other types of floating platforms, which would be anchored to the seabed, introduces some potential for entanglement risk. And now, similarly to how we are not necessarily worried or concerned with birds becoming entangled in power lines or telephone lines, we're not necessarily worried about whales or other marine megafauna becoming entangled in the mooring cables themselves. What we are concerned with is the opportunity for either gear that is abandoned, lost, or discarded fishing gear, other flotsam and jetsam, to become entangled on the lines and represent an entanglement risk there, or for secondary entanglement to happen whereby an animal that is already entangled in some gear is investigating or transiting past these structures and then, gets near enough them that there's an additional entanglement risk, which could cause something to become like an animal or debris to become racked and caught on the lines. So we're interested in knowing, can we detect entanglements on mooring lines? And that's really the premise of our project here. Our purpose and our objective here is to develop a system of technologies that could be integrated with a floating platform and a mooring line in order to be able to detect entanglement events such as those from gear or live entanglement events where an entangled animal becomes entangled with the line. The goal of our project is to detect and then confirm, and we see this as a first step eventually towards potential mitigation solution. And I just want to note that while we are very interested in continuing to pursue these types of project objectives and consider mitigation strategies, there isn't a mitigation component as part of this project. It's really the first portion of it, which is understanding what the possibilities for detection are and what the limits are. So our project has essentially three major components. And I'll note that there's going to be 3 webinars as well. There will be a webinar that's associated with each major project component, the first being the detection algorithm, which is why we're all here today. And the other 2, which include the sensor package and the inspection ROV, are in the works currently, and I'll spend just a brief amount of time talking about those. Again, we're here today to discuss our findings from the detection algorithm development, but all 3 components of this project have gone hand in hand, and they truly are designed to be a system of technologies that are integrated via communications protocol and work in concert with one another. And so I just want to briefly touch on these 2. So the first one is the development of the sensor package. This is being led by Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. And what they are tasked with doing is working with us in order to understand what type of sensor system could feasibly be in place on a mooring, like an offshore wind moored system. So we started this by understanding the mechanical limits of the system and seeing what types of responses this system might produce to both baseline or typical operations, as well as entangled conditions. And we'll talk a little bit more about how we get to those shortly. But once we have those sort of bookended ranges of highs and lows of what we might feasibly expect the system to be producing or to be outputting in terms of any kind of signal from forces that were interacting with the system, that gives us a range of parameters for sensor selection. So then the question is trying to understand which types of sensors can detect these responses in these ranges and in these locations. That led PNNL to be able to try to develop a prototype system where they could look at a variety of sensors and try to figure out ones which would best fit the purpose and location for where they might be feasibly deployed in order to detect these signals. And ask the questions like, is mechanical and electrical integration possible? And a quick example of that is early on, we identified that strain may be a really useful metric for understanding entanglement and line responses to entanglements. But in talking with industry partners, project partners, and subject matter experts, it became clear pretty quickly that developers and folks that were involved in mooring line manufacturing and deployment were likely not going to be willing to splice instrumentation in line into a mooring line. And so thinking about it in those terms, even though there are potentially interesting detection opportunities with a certain type of sensor, with a certain modality, those are the kinds of things we had to think through before we designed a system around a single type of metric, for example. So the team at PNNL, as well as the Schatz team, will have to set up a static laboratory test environment in order to prove out the efficacy of the sensors. And the objective here is a proof of concept in the static lab setting. And I'll note briefly that due to the grant terms and conditions, we're not allowed to do any natural waters testing. And so that means that all the testing needs to take place in a laboratory environment. So the question here is, can we detect and localize different loads using this sensor system? And do we see similar detectability rankings from the types of outputs that we're seeing in our simulation modeling? Another thing to note here briefly is that scaling is an incredibly important factor. And this is something that's pretty common in the offshore and marine engineering environment. But for our purposes, we're going from an average depth of 800 meters or so to a test tank of 1.8 meters, of which we can't even really use the full 1.8 meters. And so geometric scaling here is a real challenge. You could think of in terms of using a mooring line that's thinner than a human hair. And so trying to understand response characteristics of something like that, as well as by applying loads to it, wouldn't really be feasible for our purposes. But that's okay. We ended up using material scaling, which again is a common practice in industry. And so PNNL has developed a scaled platform that they've 3D printed, as well as scaled mooring lines. And the goal here will be to set this up in the tank and apply different loads at different locations on the mooring line and on the floating platform itself. And then using a suite of sensors, measure responses and characteristics of the system. I'll just talk briefly about the ROV. So again, we can't test this in natural waters, but we can test this in a tank. And this will be dispatched and controlled by a human operator. The goal here is to have the system function more or less autonomously, but the plan was always to have a human in the loop operator. And the reason for that is the launching and controlling of an ROV is a very technical and involved process. And so the goal here is not necessarily to have an autonomous inspection robot. For things like doing surveys using sea gliders or AUVs, which are autonomous underwater vehicles, that is a technology that does exist and is possible. But for doing things like station keeping or inspecting a line, a human operator is required. And so the goal is all of these would be integrated into a single system, but ultimately there would be a signal that would notify a human operator if there was some kind of event that was indicative of entanglement, and then the human operator in the loop could then make the call whether or not an inspection was warranted. And though this is going to be tested in a laboratory environment, the ROV is being designed to collect visual and other relevant data that would be relevant and appropriate for our area, and also be able to deploy down to depths that are sufficient for the Morro and Humboldt Bay wind energy areas. So now that I've talked about those two projects, I'll talk about the detection algorithm and what it is that kind of goes into that. So when I say detection algorithm, what does that really mean, and what does that do? Well, functionally, in a very simplified sense, what we're doing here is understanding the mechanics and the physics of the floating offshore wind system, and using that to train a detection algorithm that can understand the positionality and the typical operating characteristics of the system. So after using training data to train this algorithm on what the response characteristics of this typical system should be, we can then look at entangled data whereby the system interacts with some gear or an animal, some kind of live loading, and then looks at and tries to understand differences in the positionality by predicting where the system should be versus where it is seeing the position actually be. We arrive at an opportunity to detect entanglements using a physics-based approach. So, when I say detection algorithm, that's just the tip of the iceberg of what we've done here for this project. Really, the meat of this project and most of what we have been involved with, where significant time and energy expenditure has been in the modeling simulation. And briefly, Maysam will talk through that in more specifics. And I'm not going to read each of these boxes here, but I will give a kind of a high-level overview of some of the important characteristics and factors that we needed to consider for designing this simulation framework in order to get good data and good results for the opportunity to actually train a detection algorithm. In order to make sure that we felt with a good degree of confidence that what we're training the algorithm on is representative insofar as is possible. So our scope included collecting environmental data, and that covers a pretty broad swath of things. So we needed to collect mid-ocean condition data related to the operating environment for both the Humboldt and Morro Bay areas. We needed to understand what kind of physical parameters of ocean debris would be present in the area. And we needed to understand the physiological parameters for representative species of the animals that would potentially be interacting with these systems. And then finally, we needed to understand and gather technical data on the mooring systems itself. So the floating platforms, the turbines, and the mooring systems. A lot of this information is available in our environmental data memo. And we'll put a link to the chat in that so you guys can access it if you'd like, and it's also on our website. So we started using an off-the-shelf finite element solver, which is commonly used in the offshore and marine engineering environment called Orcaflex. This is a great program that allows us to investigate these types of questions, but it wasn't without the requirement for heavy modification. So some of the models existed and were more or less usable for our purposes, but again, were typically set up for much shallower water conditions and required, again, some significant modification in order to work for our circumstances. However, other models did not exist in any capacity, at least not in the context of what we needed, and not with the type of accuracy or precision that we were hoping for our simulation modeling, such as gear and animal species. For met-ocean conditions, we were lucky in that there were a series of buoys deployed, the Axis buoys, both in the Humboldt and Morro Bay wind energy areas. These buoys were deployed for a year. In Morro Bay, there was a 1-year continuous deployment. In the Humboldt area, there was a year's worth of data, but there was a mechanical failure on the buoy and it needed to be towed back in. Ultimately, it was towed back out and did collect a full year's worth of data, but the continuity was broken there. It was worthy for our purposes, though, and so we're really lucky to have site-specific data that we're able to use. We used a John swap wave spectrum for our sea states, or for our sea conditions, and we moved away from using design load conditions, or DLCs. These are things that are often referred to for doing offshore engineering or offshore development, whereby certain thresholds of conditions are met for things like safety and tolerance. We started there, but we transitioned into using statistically representative sea states after feedback from our technical advisory committee in order to model the consistent and typical conditions so that we would most often be modeling a normal operating environment, the type of conditions you'd see maybe 90% of the time versus the 1% or, 0.5% recurrence interval things. We used an NPD spectrum wind field for turbulence modeling. And again, the significant amount of force that's felt by the system is from the wind loading. And so, we wanted to make things as accurate as we could. Regarding gear, we were fortunate in working with H.T. Harvey and Associates. They were a big contributor for the environmental data memo and helped us gather useful data, particularly with the gear types. Their studies, entanglement reports, and local knowledge were used to identify prominent gear types that could be potentially present in the area, as well as commonly associated with entanglement events. So of the kinds that were identified, we chose to use long lines, gill nets, and crab traps for our modeling purposes. And none of these models really existed. We had to build these from the ground up. And we were lucky in working with some talented graduate students to help us along the way there. It was a significant effort, but we walked away feeling like with a high degree of confidence that our models were useful and representative of real world hydrodynamics. And then finally, we need to look at animals, key species for the area. Again, H.T. Harvey and Associates were incredibly helpful here with their knowledge of offshore ecology. So 8 key species were ultimately chosen, and a variety of factors were used, including presence in the wind energy areas, federal and state listing, and then relative risks of entanglement compared to other marine species. So those species ended up being these as follows. So we have baleen whales, toothed whales and dolphins, 2 pinnipeds, and a marine reptile. And again, these are not necessarily meant to be comprehensive, but they are meant to be representative in that these animals are all present in the wind energy areas, and they represent a broad range from the very biggest animal on the planet, the blue whale, to a modestly sized animal like the leatherback turtle or the sea lion, for example. And so having gathered all of these parameters that are useful for understanding the types of inputs that we might need, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Dr. Maysam Mousaviraad, to dive in a little further and explain some of the finer points of how we got from these sort of conceptual high-level areas into the numerical models that informed the detection algorithm.
Thank you, Greyson. So again, my name is Maysam Mousaviraad. I'm an associate professor in the School of Engineering here at Cal Poly Humboldt, and I'm the co-PI on this project. So in this section, I will walk through the simulation modeling work detection algorithm. The main idea is straightforward. Before we can train an algorithm to recognize an entanglement, we need to know what the floating wind system looks like when it is operating normally, and then how that response changes when an animal or a piece of gear becomes entangled. Because real entanglement events are rare and difficult to observe offshore, simulation becomes our virtual laboratory. So there are many objectives listed here on this slide, but I would group them into 3 main purposes. First, we needed a representative baseline model of a floating offshore wind system in California conditions. Second, we needed realistic representations of the possible entanglements, including animals, fishing gear, depth of entanglement, behaviors of animal entanglement, and attachment conditions. Third, we needed simulation outputs that could identify the most informative variables and generate data for the detection algorithm. So the modeling approach is based on a finite element multiphysics simulation framework. The model includes platform motion, platform line coupling, aerodynamic loading from the turbine, hydrodynamic forces from waves and currents, and the structural response of the floating system. This is an aero-hydro-servo-elastic problem, meaning that the turbine, controller, platform, mooring lines, and ocean environment are all interacting. So for the turbine, we use the 15 megawatt offshore reference wind turbine developed through the International Energy Agency framework, and we have also implemented the NREL's reference open source controller. The controller governs torque and blade pitch, and it helps prevent the turbine from amplifying platform motions. It also feathers the blades when conditions become critical. The floating structure is based on the University of Maine's Voltern USS reference platform. It is a 4-column semi-submersible platform with a structural height of about 35 meters and a width of more than 100 meters. This type of platform has a strong wave motion resistance and is specifically designed for deep environments like the California wind energy areas. The mooring system required substantial modification because the original reference platform definition incorporated a catenary mooring system designed for a water depth of 200 meters. This is much shallower than the California call areas we are studying, where the depths are roughly between 750 to 1,300 meters deep. Discussing with our project partner, Principal Powers, and other experts in the field, we determined that a semi-taut mooring system is the most probable configuration to be deployed. So that meant moving the anchors closer to the platform, changing the mooring material from chain to polyester, and adjusting platform ballast, pretension, and anchor layout. This was a critical step because the stiffness of the mooring system strongly affects how a small entanglement signal is transmitted to the platform and to the potential sensors. So we optimize the system parameters to achieve reasonable designs and overall system stiffnesses for 2 water depths of 754 meters and 1,300 meters. Greyson talked about the inputs, and then we need those inputs for our simulation. So once the turbine, platform, and moorings were established, we added the environmental inputs. These included the waves, currents, and stochastic turbine wind fields, turbulent wind fields, and we also incorporated the geometry, force, and behavior of animals and gear. So incorporating appropriate environmental input was important because the ocean itself creates a large amount of motion and noise in the system. And detecting entanglement means finding a relatively small signal inside that much larger environmental response. So a key decision was how to choose the ocean conditions for the simulations. Traditional offshore design often focuses on a standard design load cases, DLCs, which include normal and extreme storm conditions. That approach is important for structural safety, but it is not necessarily the best approach for entanglement detection. A detection system will spend most of its life operating during ordinary, frequently occurring conditions. So we used a machine learning clustering approach to identify appropriate representative sea states for the Humboldt Bay and Morro Bay call areas. And the result of this process was 7 sea states for each call area that capture the majority of expected operating conditions. This made the simulations more relevant to the real detection problem rather than focusing on rare extreme conditions. Next, we needed realistic estimates of how much force an entangled animal could apply. This is a difficult question because we cannot simply measure the pulling force of a whale during an entanglement. The approach used biological scaling. So the team estimated force from the cross-sectional area of the largest vertebrae, combined that with the length of the animal, and then used regression relationships to estimate force across size classes. So in total, our analysis used 113 specimens, including 30 measured by our own team, as you can see on that picture. This gave us maximum and sub-maximum force estimates for the key species that Greyson talked about, those 8 key species that we have identified. These forces became one of the most important inputs to entanglement simulations. So to evaluate these force estimates, we used the predicted force magnitudes to simulate animal locomotion and assess whether they produced realistic swimming speeds. So we then compared this simulated maximum swimming speeds with values reported in the literature. As you can see in the table, while the agreement was not exact, the simulated speeds generally fell within realistic ranges for each species. This comparison provided confidence that the animal models we are using in our simulations are not producing unreasonable forces or motions. We also compiled representative morphometric and diving data for the key species included in our simulations. These data included body length, girth, volume, mass, and typical diving depth. The diving depth is specifically important because the effects of an entanglement event can vary substantially with depth. For example, an entanglement near the surface may influence the fairlead and platform motions differently than an entanglement occurring hundreds of meters below the surface. So to account for this variability with depth, we selected 3 representative depths for each species, and those 3 depths correspond to shallow, intermediate, and deep diving scenarios. These depths were chosen to represent plausible entanglement locations based on the diving behavior of each species. We tested several ways of representing an animal entangled on a mooring line. The simplest option is to apply a force directly to the mooring line, as you can see on the bottom left. The next option is to attach a mass representing the animal and apply force to that mass. And the most realistic option is the third option, which includes an interstitial line connecting the animal to the mooring line. This matters because the animal does not behave like a simple external load. It has mass, inertia, drag, and motion relative to the mooring system. As shown on the bottom right image, our sensitivity work showed that applying force alone was not sufficient. So moving forward, we used an interstitial line representation because it better captures the mechanics of the entanglement. This slide shows the basic comparison that derives the entire analysis. So the baseline case is the floating wind system without an entanglement. The other videos show entanglements on different mooring lines. What we are looking for is not just whether the system moves, because it always is moving under waves, wind, and current. The question is whether the entanglement changes the system response in a measurable way. And every detection approach later in the presentation builds on this comparison between baseline and entangled behavior. So our initial animal representations were intentionally simplified, but we recognized the need to capture more realistic behaviors. To improve the models, we consulted with animal behavior experts, Desiree Reeve and Lars Howell, and incorporated both normal swimming and startle response behaviors. So during an entanglement event, animals may thrash, tail slap, arch their bodies, or transition between different levels of exertion. Capturing these behaviors was important for representing the dynamic forces that may be generated during an interaction. Also, to model animal locomotion, we represented each animal as a series of articulated cylindrical segments with prescribed time-varying relative orientations between those segments, as you can see in the animation. This approach allowed the models to generate forces that varied over time while accounting for the hydrodynamic drag and inertial effects of the animal's body as it moved through the water. As a result, the animal behaved as dynamic systems interacting with their environment rather than as simple constant force pulling loads. The articulation was based on real-world observations of swimming animals and available motion data representing startled behaviors. We tested both 2-segment and 3-segment representations, as you can see in those 2 videos. And ultimately, the 2-segment model appeared sufficient for the purposes of this project. That provided a useful engineering trade-off, as we want enough fidelity to capture the important dynamics, but not so much complexity that the simulations become too expensive or unstable for large run sets. So in summarize, in the context of this project, when we say dynamic animal modeling, we mean 3 things. First, the thrust force oscillates because the force changes through the tail or flipper stroke. And second, the animal is modeled as a multi-body dynamic system with drag and inertia. Third, the animal can exhibit different representative behaviors in different simulations. We also introduced stochastic variability to reflect natural variation. This is important because real animals do not move in perfectly repeatable patterns. We also included the transition that occurs when an air-breathing animal can no longer continue swimming. So at the end of the expected dive duration, tail motion and associated forces are reduced progressively until they reach 0. This was important because a deceased animal may drift with the current and pull on the line in a different direction than a live, actively swimming animal. We included that transition to improve the realism of the simulated entanglement responses. So we organized animal responses into 3 representative behavioral scenarios. These are not meant to cover every possible animal response, but they span a useful range of behavior. And they include all-out struggle, burst and cruise behavior, and calm or reduced struggling with occasional startle response. So the first behavior is the all-out case. In this scenario, the animal struggles continuously at high effort. This creates a strong force signal, but it also means the animal exhausts itself fastest, and this behavior is expected to be more representative of a species such as humpback whales or California sea lions. From a detection perspective, this behavior tends to produce a stronger and more persistent dynamic signal. The second one, the burst and cruise behavior, here the animal produces a burst of high force and then reduces effort and continues swimming at a lower level before bursting again. It produces a time-varying signal that is different from a continuous struggle, and that distinction matters because the detection algorithm may respond not only to force magnitude, but also to the pattern and frequency content of the motion. And the third behavior C, is calm or cease struggling. So this behavior is when the animal may remain mostly still or drift with occasional startle responses. This produces a less continuous signal, which is distinct from the other 2 behaviors, and it is important to model. Some species, such as killer whales and northern elephant seals, may be more likely to exhibit this type of response. So this slide shows several species models. The key point is that we are not simply scaling the same animal up and down. We are species that are modeled in our simulations. The species differ in size, shape, and body configuration, strengths, swimming speed, and tail beat frequency. We also studied the sensitivity to the interstitial line, especially the length and the mechanical properties of the line. That matters, again, because the line connecting the animal to the mooring line can filter or amplify the force transmitted into the system. So here we show blue whale simulations with different interstitial line length. These are all shown for burst and cruise behavior B, and the purpose was to understand how the length of the connecting line changes the force transfer and the system response. A short line and a long line can produce different timing, different peak loads, and different motion patterns at the mooring line. Next slide, this one shows the same idea, but for a different species. This one is for killer whales. The size and force scales are obviously different, but also the behavior frequency is different from the previous simulations. This is important because detectability is not only about size. A smaller animal with higher frequency motion can sometimes create a signal that stands out more clearly than we might expect. So to summarize, the animal modeling represents the animals as multi-body dynamic systems with inertia and hydrodynamic drag. Tail motion was modeled as an oscillatory process where frequency, amplitude, and force vary over time depending on species and behavior. We also included snap loading, which is the moment when the entanglement first becomes taut. That snap event can produce a short, high-intensity response that may be important for detection. So overall, this is one of the major advances of the project, which is moving from simple static animal loads to dynamic entangled animal simulations. We also modeled gear entanglements. These are important because abandoned, lost, or derelict fishing gear can become caught on mooring lines and may create secondary entanglement hazards. So the models had to be developed iteratively because previous dynamic models for these gear types did not exist or did not meet the requirements for our project. And this slide shows an example of a crab trap interacting with the mooring system. The goal is to capture the dynamics of the objects that could realistically be present in California waters to determine detection strategies. And the next slide is gillnet. Gillnets introduce a different modeling challenge. They are flexible, distributed structures with a large surface area, and they interact strongly with the surrounding water. So modeling every strand directly would be computationally impractical. So mesh scaling was essential. The challenge was to preserve the important hydrodynamic and structural dynamic behavior while keeping the model efficient enough to run across many scenarios. This is a good example of the balance between fidelity and computational tractability. So once we had baseline simulations and entanglement simulations, we could ask the central question. The central question is, which measurements change in a detectable way? So we evaluated a few different variables. Namely, we evaluated the platform motions, the mooring line forces, and the line angles. We compared baseline and entangled cases in both the time domain and the frequency domain, as you can see two examples on these two plots. And the important finding was that some variables do show clear sensitivity to entanglement. This is the point where the modeling work begins to connect directly to sensor location and algorithm development. And this is the final slide on this section of the presentation. So the final output of this modeling section is a set of key variables and simulation data set that feed the detection algorithm. The modeling results suggested that fair lead angles, platform yaw, fair lead forces, and line strain are among the most useful variables for detecting entanglement signatures. These same results informed sensor type, sensor location, and sensor sensitivity considerations. And in summary, the simulation work is our virtual lab that directly supports the design of the detection system. So with that context, I will hand it over to Eli, who will explain how those simulation outputs are used to develop and evaluate the detection algorithm.
Thanks, Maysam. I'm Eli Wallach. I'm a senior research engineer with the Schatz Energy Research Center, and I've been conducting a lot of the work on the detection algorithm as well as simulation work for this project. As Maysam stated, I'm going to be going over some of the details of the detection algorithm. And as Greyson noted earlier, this is really the tip of the iceberg for this project with all this supporting work that Maysam went over supporting it. So Maysam presented some of the simulation work that led up to this stage, and this includes the environmental conditions, the animal and gear modeling, the platform behavior, including dynamics and hydrostatics, and this all leads to the finite element analysis in Orcaflex, or the simulations. Then we have data windowing and feature extraction. The steps that I will be presenting here are shown in the purple boxes and include training a neural network to estimate summary metrics, establishing an error threshold for detection, which leads to the final goal of the project, which is line level detection. So there are a few key challenges with this that I really want to highlight. Complexity is a key challenge. And here we're really talking about how many different situations we are looking to simulate and understand, as well as how different these situations may be. Firstly, we are looking at simulating a wide range of animals that span from a sea turtle all the way to the largest animal ever with a blue whale. We are also looking at a wide range of gear simulations that have a similar span in magnitude. For each of these entanglements, they could occur on any of the 3 mooring lines and at a wide range of depths, with some animals such as the sperm whale capable of diving to the sea floor depths in the wind energy areas. Another complexity is sea states. In different weather conditions, the floating offshore wind turbine and mooring system behave differently, so we want to consider all of these different sea states and weather conditions. The number of different possible combinations for these things gets out of hand quickly. Another key challenge is the magnitude of forces produced by entangled animals and fishing gear. These forces are very small relative to the scale of offshore floating wind turbines and mooring systems. Even the largest animal ever, the blue whale, is only about 1/4% of the mass of the entire system, despite having a staggering mass of almost 57,000 kilograms. To further illustrate this challenge, we can consider the typical line tensions in the upwind mooring lines are around 1,700 kilonewtons, or 190 tons under Earth's gravity, and to use some highly non-scientific units, about 5 fully loaded semi-trucks. The most energetic behavior simulated for blue whale generate only 13 kilonewtons average thrust force, which is only 0.8% of the working line tension. So now I can talk about some of the different work that was done on the development of the detection algorithm and some different paths that we explored while developing this algorithm. This started with exploratory data analysis, directly comparing the baseline and entanglement cases under identical sea states, which allowed us to isolate the effects of entanglement and gain understanding on what variables would be useful for detecting entanglement, as Maysam presented. We then took this knowledge and considered multiple machine learning techniques. Machine learning is a really attractive approach to this problem, as we saw that for most cases, single variable response to entanglement was limited, but by using machine learning, we can consider a wide array of combinations of different variables to make the analysis much more multivariate. We started considering a structured classification approach. The main issue we saw with this approach is its reliance on entanglement data for training of the neural network. In this simulation setting, this may be possible to generate these different entanglement cases, but for a real-world deployment, gathering sufficient sample size of the wide range of entanglement cases that could exist is likely not possible. So we moved on to thinking about some other approaches. The next approach we considered was an autoencoder-based approach. I will describe this in a bit more detail on the next slide, but this approach is commonly used for anomaly detection in time series data and can be trained on only baseline unentangled data, which makes it very attractive. However, training an autoencoder for this system proved to be challenging. So the final approach that we have moved forward with is using a convolutional neural network for parameter estimation. This draws on some of the core ideas of the autoencoder, but greatly reduces the complexity of the required neural network and maintains the key benefit of training on only baseline data. So this next slide covers the concept of an autoencoder with a simple example. Although we didn't end up using this approach, the selected approach relies on some of the same principles. so I think it's interesting to present. An autoencoder is built of two parts, both are neural networks, an encoder which simplifies the input signal into a much smaller amount of data that still captures the important features of the signal called the latent layer, and a decoder which can take this latent layer and reconstruct the signal it describes. When used for anomaly detection, these two elements are trained solely on baseline typical data. Then in anomaly cases, they don't do a good job of compressing and recreating the signal. Thus, the error or difference between the input signal and output from the autoencoder become the indicator for anomalies. In this simple case shown on the slide, we have an encoder and a decoder. Let's imagine that these are trained on regular sine wave signals only. In the top normal case, we can see that sine wave is input. The encoder pulls out the important parameters. For sine wave, these would be amplitude, period, and phase shift, or x1, x2, and x3 on the slide. So our latent layer has only 3 values to describe the sine curve with perfect accuracy. The decoder then takes this latent layer and outputs exactly the same sine curve that was input, because this decoder was trained specifically for sine curves. In the anomaly case, the data input does not follow the trends expected by the encoder. It still comes up with some parameters that it thinks describe the signal, and the decoder can generate an output. But looking at this output, we can see that the sine curve with these parameters does not match the input signal for this anomaly case. Because the autoencoder had a significant error in recreating the initial signal, we know that this is not a typical case that it was trained on. We worked to train a long short-term memory autoencoder for detection of anomalies in the mooring line departure angle and platform locations. And LSTM autoencoders are commonly used for this type of time series anomaly detection. But we found that it was difficult to train and it did not perform well. It's likely due to the chaotic and random nature of the system being responsive to stochastic wave and wind fields, where this approach would likely be better suited for a more controlled or regulated system. As such, there's no strong underlying relationship that we're trying to train the autoencoder. And we move to our final selected approach of using a convolutional neural network to predict summary metrics for the system. This approach trains the neural network to take time series inputs of platform position, rotation, and environmental conditions and predict summary metrics for key variables which we found to be sensitive to entanglement, such as the mooring line departure angles and distributed line strains. This is a nice approach because it's based on the physical relationship between the location of the platform and the angle of these lines. CNNs are commonly used for image classification and time series analysis and are well suited for this type of data. We can also see some of the same core concepts present in the autoencoder approach, such as looking at the difference between the actual value of the summary metric from simulation versus the predicted value from the neural network. If there's a significant error in the neural network estimated values, it's likely that it is looking at an anomaly case and something not present in the training set has occurred, in such as an entanglement. This CNN approach has some key benefits. Next slide, please. Such as being simpler to train and troubleshoot. It builds on the exploratory analysis from the simulations, and it allows us to focus on key variables we know to be sensitive to entanglement. And again, it maintains a very key benefit from the autoencoder approach, that it can be trained on only baseline data, making it feasible to train and implement in a real-world deployment of a turbine. So jumping to some of the analysis that we use to inform our decisions on how to configure the detection algorithm. As Maysam already presented, the most sensitive variables to entanglement were line end orientations, platform yaw, and line strains, particularly distributed line strain. We also found that time domain results were more sensitive than frequency domain results. We further explored these key variables to select what summary metric would be best suited for our approach and looked at several different metrics, including mean standard deviation, skew, kurtosis, and peak excitation frequency. We found that the strongest indicators were skew, kurtosis, and standard deviation of the line departure angles. Going a step further, once we started training these neural networks, we found that the CNN did a better job at predicting standard deviations, So this is the summary metric that we focused on moving forward. This work is still ongoing, so I can describe the cases that are planned to be included in the final result set, as well as the cases that are included in the result set we have to share today. We started by looking at a single sea state to keep things simple, and we generated 200 hours of baseline simulations for the sea state that we refer to internally as Humboldt 3, as this is the third cluster from our k-means analysis. This Humboldt 3 sea state represents the most common met ocean conditions for the wind energy area. We also looked at a range of entanglement cases with the sea state for 4 animal representations in 5 gear types. 30% of these baseline cases are set aside for validation, while the remaining 70% are used in training. Moving forward, we are working to generalize this approach to consider many different sea states. This represents a big step forward in realistically approaching this problem, but it also means the number of required simulations greatly increases. The baseline set here has already been simulated and includes 5 random actualizations of each of the 14 considered sea states for 2 hours apiece, or a total of 140 hours of training data. Animal cases include 3 entanglement scenarios describing the entangled line and animal heading, 3 different depths, 3 different animal behaviors, 8 species, and 14 sea states, totaling over 3,000 cases to consider. Gear cases include 2 entangled mooring lines at 3 depths and 7 gear types in the 14 sea states, totaling just under 600 cases to consider. And we are still working through these simulations. Now jumping into some results from this approach. Again, these results are based on data considering only a single sea state, and these include a more limited selection of animal entanglements and behaviors, focusing primarily on behavior B, the burst and cruise behavior, with cases representing blue whale, killer whale, Pacific white-sided dolphin, and northern elephant seal at 3 different depths on lines 1 and 3. Line 1 represents the upwind line, while line 3 represents the downwind line in this sea state. Gear entanglements are also represented on lines 3 and include line-type objects, small and large gill nets, crab traps, and large flowers of crab traps. The figure on the right of this slide shows the measured and predicted standard deviation for the mooring line azimuth. In black for the baseline cases not used in training, and in red for the entanglement cases. You can see many of these load or entanglement cases fall near the 1-to-1 perfect prediction line, while some fall far outside of this perfect prediction, indicating some detectability using this approach. The next slide focuses on how we determine a detection threshold. This is based on additive error across predicted metrics for a single mooring line, in this case, downwind line 3. The figure shows the distribution of the test cases as well as the load cases for line 3. And we set the detection threshold at the 95th percentile for validation cases, which explicitly accepts a 5% false positive rate. You can see that this detection threshold has a dotted vertical line on the distribution graphic. The fact that much of the load case distribution falls to the left of this line indicates that some entanglements are not detectable with this approach. However, a significant portion lies to the right of this line, and these would be detectable. Next slide, please. This table shows some of the specifics that make up this distribution. We noted that larger animals were more detectable, as well as entanglements on line 3, as this is under less tension than the upwind lines in the sea state. Entanglements that were nearer to the surface were also more detectable. And as Maysam alluded to, animals with high frequency behavior were also seen to be more detectable. For example, an elephant seal was seen to be more detectable than a killer whale, despite being a smaller animal. This is a really cool result as it supports our team's approach to carefully define these animal representations. Remarkably, it seems this approach is capable of detecting gear entanglements in some cases, despite the relatively small forces compared to typical system forces. Next slide, please. We feel that this has been an interesting and successful first step to understanding this issue. We're excited to continue work under this project. The insights we have gained about how these entanglements might be detected using this algorithm approach should help inform future monitoring and research efforts. This project has been a strong first step to answer the research question: can sensors be installed on these floating offshore wind turbines and platforms to detect entanglements on the mooring lines? We think that these systems could be used to detect larger entanglement risks, such as large gill nets and active animal entanglements, particularly of larger species, but note that there are some limitations. An important caveat to note is that the results we have presented are based on computer modeling and still need to be validated. Due to the black box nature of machine learning, it's possible the detection algorithm is picking up on modeling artifacts that would not be present in a real-world system to detect these entanglements. This is one of the reasons we have included some scale model testing on this project. I'm really looking forward to seeing the outcomes of the scale model testing over the next few months, as it's planned to take place in just a few weeks. Next slide, please. This problem is often thought of as how to keep animals alive, and I just want to highlight that detecting an entanglement and being able to save the animal are very different things. In the case of detecting an animal entanglement, it takes several minutes to gather data, then detect the entanglement with some certainty, and several more minutes to deploy an inspection ROV and confirm. This leaves very little, if any, time to save an air-breathing animal. So detections from this type of system would allow for removal of gear to reduce risk of entanglements from animals, but not animal rescue in the case of an active animal entanglement. Well, the sensor-based approach has shown promise for detecting entanglements, particularly those with active animal and larger gear that would pose the greatest risk to marine life. There is a limit to what can be detected with this approach. I think this detection system would help support efforts as an early warning system for large marine debris and to further reduce risks of secondary entanglement using a line walker or other periodic inspection and detangling ROV to keep these lines clear of debris that might cause secondary entanglement but is too small to be noticed by the methods presented today would be warranted. And I will note that this system definitely could reduce the need for inspection and reduce the burden on those ROVs. And although it's a bit out of scope, particularly with regards to mooring system health, as mooring line or anchor failures would be readily detected with these types of systems. And finally, just a quick word about sensor selection. Many different types of sensors were considered for this project. We mostly focus on sensors that are market ready. These are primarily mechanical-based sensors such as strain gauges, IMUs, and angle sensors. We also considered some more novel technologies, but found them to be infeasible for the application at this time, including fiber optics. These sensors can be incredibly sensitive and can pinpoint very small strain effects. However, current technologies use glass fibers, which are not feasible given strain requirements of this system. Essentially, the mooring lines are too stretchy and the fiber optics would break. Polymer fiber optics are currently being developed, and they could possibly overcome this issue, this strain issue, but we found these to be too early in development for consideration. We also consider the possibility for acoustic detection or acoustic imaging approaches. These have several drawbacks, including that they are very power intensive. They add additional complexity to the system and additional snagging points for gear and wildlife. And they could be loud enough to be disruptive to wildlife on their own. And with that, I think we're going to open the floor for questions.
Thank you so much, Eli and Maysam and Greyson. Really appreciate it, and thanks to everyone in the audience for your interest and attention. I think we have had a couple of questions that have come in the Q&A window, and I think just starting off, there's a question just about mooring lines and mechanics. what materials are used for the mooring line, and what is the predicted baseline strain change caused by entanglement on a top rope or just the mooring line as it's installed. Does one of you want to field that question?
Eli, are you able to answer?
Sure. The mooring line materials that we considered were polyester. I think there are also considerations for or designs for nylon mooring ropes for these types of systems. But our simulations considered polyester. The baseline change in strain, I don't want to quote a number that's incorrect. Definitely on average, even for a blue whale, it's going to be less than 1%, but there may be spikes caused by this initial snap loading that are above that number. Yeah.
And I guess just following on that line of questioning, just related to the sensor feasibility, do strain gauges or other sensors that might be considered have the required sensitivity to detect the specific strain delta? And I think you talked about that a bit, but if you want to elaborate on the feasibility of the gauges in terms of what's commercially available.
I think this is probably a better question for someone at PNNL, as they are the kind of sensor experts for this project. My sense is that strain gauges do have the required sensitivity, particularly if they were spliced in line. But like Greyson said, this is not something that developers are really willing to do, to add these additional failure points into the mooring line. I think there's a little bit too much noise in the system at the fair lead, or at the connection between the mooring line and the platform for a strain gauge to be really effective at detecting entanglements at that location.
Thank you. This is a question for Maysam. Can you summarize what variable or variables in the animal model have the most uncertainty or warrant further research or data to improve the model, and what part of the animal model has the best levels of certainty?
Sure. So basically, the the startle behavior, even though we used some motion data, and we did our best to incorporate all the available literature and the behavior of the animal when they get entangled. However, I don't think there has been any published scientific rigorous work on studying or basically documenting the exact behaviors that animals could exhibit when entangled. So I think one of the biggest uncertainties in that realm is the behavior itself, the frequency, the amount of exertion, or the duration of exertion before going to calm behavior and come back to another exertion. And also, we need more species-specific startle behavior. So far, the 3 behaviors that we have identified and included are observations mostly for whales and other large mammals. So more species-specific behavior would be an obvious next step.
I'll just piggyback on what Maysam was saying really quickly too, and note that for like the force estimates, we feel like we had a really good basis for this with the like the whale models, so the cetaceans. some of this was based on work that was previously done looking at forces that animals could impart by like thrusting forward, pressing their nose against a pressure plate. So there was laboratory data to back up some of the findings and to sort of inform the analysis that was originally done by Arthur et al. And so that was pretty well in hand for being able to use the in terms of a basis for force modeling for those species. In terms of for the pinniped and the marine reptile modeling, though, a similar level of analysis and study hasn't been done, at least to our knowledge, and so that's kind of one area that we felt pretty solid about with the force models for the cetaceans. But when it came to the other animal species, we wanted to be careful there and understand those forces based on any established or published findings we could glean, but also the hydrodynamic characteristics of those species. Yeah.
I guess just building on the questions related to the modeling of the marine life interactions. How did our team select drag coefficients for the marine mammals and gear entanglements? And are drag coefficients flow dependent?
Yeah, we worked closely with a graduate student who is really focused on the biology of these whales, Ben Pradanoff, and he actually introduced us to some really interesting texts that use glide ratios and other observational data on whales to calculate these drag coefficients. So ultimately, they're literature values, but I thought some of the techniques that were used were really clever in order to determine these drag coefficients. And I don't believe these are flow dependent. No.
Yeah, so the drag coefficient is not flow dependent, but obviously the drag force is. But the CD value, we use constant values.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess I'll just also add that we have drag coefficients are separated by the direction of flow. So flow in the axial direction and flow in the transverse direction have separate drag coefficients, which helps keep the animals oriented in in their natural forward-facing direction.
And maybe just one more shout out to Ben. I see that Ben is here in the audience, so thank you, Ben, for all that great work. I guess another question on maybe a similar line of thinking. Have there been documented observations of marine mammals interacting with monitoring equipment or mooring infrastructure out of apparent curiosity? And are behavior tendencies considered when designing monitoring systems? Greyson, you want to take that one?
Yeah. So there's like a couple ways to think about it, and one person that we didn't mention in the presentation, who we did communicate with, was Anne Bowles, a researcher at Hub's SeaWorld Research Institute, and we didn't get necessarily direct data from her in terms of things like animal poses or forces or things like that, but she was somebody that we talked with fairly extensively about potential behaviors for understanding these types of these interactions. And I think the short answer is, with regard to these types of offshore systems, they at the scale that's being proposed currently, these systems don't really exist as of yet. But what we got from Anne and Hub's SeaWorld folks was that typically cetaceans such as dolphins are highly curious and are very interested in exploring gear and other types of novel structures in the water. And so while we don't have specific behavioral, there isn't a specific behavioral component that's in our research project. And what I mean by that is we didn't model a baseline condition and then the probability that an animal would interact with the structure. We modeled what the conditions look like during typical operations, so like what the responses of the system are under normal like power producing conditions, and then what an entanglement looks like. We tried to capture the moment of entanglement as well as an entanglement during like a deceased animal being entangled, and the different loading characteristics of all those events, but we didn't try to understand the probability or like the curiosity of an animal interacting with the structure. I do think that's really interesting, but it's not in the scope of what we were trying to do.
Thank you.
And then I'll just note one more thing really quick. I was reminded by Ben Pradhanov of this. Thanks, Ben. From what Ben has read and also from our understanding doing past literature review, there's very little to no data on gear entanglement or secondary entanglements being recorded on oil and gas platforms. A lot of the floating semi-submersible structures, like what we modeled here, are based on those similar types of structures, so these semi-submersible moored platforms, and there's very little data about entanglements on mooring lines in those systems. But again, there are some differences to consider, both in regulatory environments, locations throughout the world, and also number, where in typical oil and gas platform, you'd have, a single rig in a field somewhere, or maybe a handful here and there. But I think a lot of the concern here is that we're not talking about a single platform with 3 to 6 or 8 lines or however many you have. We'd be talking about many tens to potentially hundreds of lines in a fully developed wind energy area. And so it's this sort of, there's a potentially additive effect and where there's a potential increase for risk.
Thanks. And I guess as we talk about the topic of marine life behavior, just want to give a shout out to Erica Escajeda of H.D. Harvey and Associates, I guess now Integral Consulting, who has been a key partner for us in that aspect of the project. So a big thank you to Erica and colleagues for those contributions to the effort. Here's a question about environmental noise and simulation, which is how do wave and current forces impact the signal to noise ratio and real world detectability? Can these environmental noise factors be effectively integrated into the simulation models? Do you want to take that, Maysam?
Yeah, so I can speak to that. Yes, so that is one of the biggest challenge in this project, that the environment itself generates quite a bit of randomness, and we did our best to set up all of our simulations with realistic stochastic inputs to generate environments that are similar to real world ocean environment. And we ran our simulations long enough so that we would capture the majority of different types of winds and waves and currents that would happen in a given sea state. So each of our simulations are focused on one single sea state, but even if the sea state is constant, it does not mean that you would get waves with constant amplitude or frequency, or you would get the same wind speeds or wind direction or the current speed and direction and depth of the currents. So all of those are variabilities that we did include in our simulations. And more details about the technical engineering level of the the way we implemented those in our models. You can find them in a published report we had on our simulation setup and results. We did not include many of those details on these slides, but they are available upon request. I guess the other part of the question was, can these environmental noise factors be effectively integrated into your simulation models? We feel like we have effectively included all of the uncertainties and variabilities, but then again, we are limited to the accuracy and representativeness of the inputs that are available, the metocean data that we used. We relied on sources that were measuring the metocean data for long periods of time, and we feel confident that we use the best available inputs possible, but then again, there is always room for improvements.
Thank you. Here's a question about, I guess, just practicalities of integration. The question is, have we been in contact with the California offshore wind area developers about implementing this technology? And I guess a follow-on to that would be, if so, have there been discussions about just about the feasibility of doing so? And I guess in addition to the developers, I think it's useful to note that Principal Power, which is a platform developer, a floating platform developer, is part of our project team. So some of that we have had conversations, obviously, in that context, and maybe in responding to the question, we could integrate some of that input as well. Greyson, do you want to start there?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I think Arne did a great job of summing up kind of the involvement we've had with at least having a platform developer on the project team. I think the other thing to note is that through the POC and through our normal research endeavors, we've actually had, I'd say, quite a few conversations with platform developers, maybe at least from our project team's perspective, a little bit more with the two Humboldt leaseholders than the Morro Bay ones. But what I would also note is that the technology in the capacity that we've developed it is a fairly low TRL level. And so this is really being done on a sort of like feasibility scale and conceptual level. And so while we are having model testing that's happening early next month, and we are developing like a real ROV, which could be actively deployed, those components are at a stage where they're really kind of understanding the feasibility and the conceptual framework for developing this type of system of technology. So it's not necessarily in this ready state that we could then take to a developer and say, hey, this is ready to deploy on your platform or within your array. It is in a place though, or we feel like it's going to be in a place where I think shortly we have approximately another year and several months in the project. And, obviously we'd love to continue this type of work. And so then certainly next stages would be further testing and doing some natural waters testing. But there would be some runway ahead before we were able to approach developers with a specific technology. What I think is an interesting finding from this is, we've determined through the initial stages of our project, again, as Eli mentioned, primarily with simulation modeling, but we do feel like there are some pretty real and significant opportunities for both detection and, structural health monitoring that are disparate from just launching an ROV or doing crewed inspections. And so what this could represent is if there are future regulatory hurdles that need to be considered, or different environmental monitoring protections that need to be met, then some sort of system, maybe similar to what we're working on now, could be useful in kind of providing continuous real-time monitoring for a variety of factors, and I guess potentially reducing opportunities for entanglement or other kinds of interactions with a line that are distinct from just what you would typically expect from a normal operation.
Thanks. Eli or Maysam, anything you want to add to the discussion about input from developers and feedback we've received?
No,
I think Greyson did a good job. I don't have anything to add.
Great.
Same here.
Another question that came in is just given that the wind turbines are generating electricity, has there been any consideration of sacrificial anodes and how they might fit into the system? And is that something that was considered in setting up the simulation?
So I would say that so far we have not included the electricity lines in our simulation. So the lines that are included in our models so far are the mooring lines that are pre-tensioned to keep the floating structure in place, and not letting the floating structure to move further than a certain radius limit. However, in a real offshore wind farm environment, there are a lot more cables that are undersea, and those cables are connected, the inter-array cables that are connected between the towers, and then also somehow connected to a power transmission system. And those would also generate additional entanglement risk. And that study, the study of the electricity lines, would be an additional type of project that should be handled in a future research.
Great. I think maybe just a closing question that I will ask, which is maybe if we can articulate some of the upcoming activities that we're anticipating over the coming months, particularly as it relates to some of the work that our partners are doing. We talked a bit about that early on in the presentation, but I think now that we're at the end, it's useful to talk about how that work fits into the detection algorithm work that was described later in the presentation. So maybe Greyson, if you can just give a brief overview of what's coming up, both in terms of laboratory work that's being led by Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, and some of the associated work that's being done by Mare, and how that relates to an integrated system that would be one of the key endpoint deliverables of this project.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you noted, there's this portion of the project is we've cleared some major hurdles with it, and really met a lot of the scoped deliverables that we had in terms of thinking through a lot of the modeling and simulation work and coming up with a detection algorithm. So now the goal moving forward is to continue to refine that system to the best that we can, because we're learning things as we go, but then integrate this with the sensor package and the ROV that are being developed. In terms of timing for those, over the next, five, I guess 3 to 5 months or so, there's going to be a lot that's happening on the project. So in July, early July, the Schatz team and the PNNL team are going to conduct the scale testing of the sensor system in the test tank at the PNNL campus in Richland, Washington. And from that, we'll be collecting data for as wide of a range of entanglement scenarios as we can to understand the responses of the sensor system, and again how that meshes with what we've modeled. So then several months from there will be, I guess actually I should step back and say, in parallel, Mare, which is the ROV team, they have been working on the inspection and confirmation ROV and have made great strides there. And it's in a pretty good place in terms of the amount of componentry that's been assembled and tested. They're doing ongoing pressure testing. They have a pressure vessel that they can test individual bottles and components. And ultimately, each of the components, and by bottles, I mean a housing that would contain an electronic or electric component that could be, basically sent down and is depth rated for whatever depth it is designed for. It's being designed for the depths offshore in the California Morro and Humboldt Bay wind energy areas. So beyond 1,000 meters of depth, that will be assembled and then tested in a test tank, and essentially we'll need to be able to run through a full range of operational motions as though it were being deployed. Again, we're not able or allowed by the terms of the grant agreement to deploy in natural waters, so that will all have to take place in the test tank. But over the next several months, the laboratory testing for both the sensor package and the ROV are going to be taking place. When those are finished, we have draft reports for the development of those due, I believe, in October, and then the work will continue with integrating these systems via communications protocol. And the way that this is designed to work is really to mimic how it's being thought about functioning in the real world, and that would be again, through a communications network, because the idea is that this ROV would be hosted on a platform somewhere and would be communicating continually with the network that is plugged into the sensor package and the detection algorithm. So as those things work in concert, and they're able to send a signal to a human-in-the-loop operator who can then launch the ROV and perform the inspection to either confirm that there is indeed some kind of issue on the system, or if there's an anomaly that's being reported. And something we've seen from our development work here is that the signal to noise ratio is profound. Even the greatest forces that you could possibly consider entangling, at least with what we modeled, like animals and gear, are just a tiny fraction of the mass and forces associated with this whole system. And so, that's really kind of the goal over the next several months. And as I noted in the beginning of the webinar, we have planned additional outreach events or webinars for each of the 2 other development portions of the project. So both for the sensor package and the ROV development, we'll plan on hosting a webinar similar to this one, where we'll go through some of the finer points of the project specifics, the development journey, and the results.
Thanks so much. And we did have one more question that came in, which is, does the model cover worst case scenarios? And what are the bounds of those types of scenarios that were considered? And how reliable or sensitive is the model to extreme conditions?
Yeah, I definitely want to speak to this worst case scenario question. This was really interesting to me, but early on we did simulate some very extreme sea states. And we actually found that in these extreme sea states, these, like 50-year storm type sea states, the signal from the animal was relatively detectable compared to even more common sea states. And the reason is because in these high wind conditions, the turbine will furl its blades to prevent the turbine from being damaged, which those aerodynamic forces are the largest forces in the system. So some of the things that we would think of as a worst case scenario from an engineering standpoint are actually some of the better case scenarios for a detectability standpoint, which was really not a finding that I had anticipated. On the biggest limitations, I think that Greyson really just spoke to this, which is the signal to noise ratio, that essentially, since the common typical system forces are so high that it's really challenging to detect these animal forces. And then in terms of reliability, we're still working to improve the detection algorithm, and I think it can get better. But we've seen, for larger animals, we see sometimes north of 50% of the window time series being detected. But for a lot of the gear, it is much less than 50%. So, yeah. I don't know if Maysam, you want to add to any of those comments.
Yeah, thank you, Eli. I would just add that when we selected those 7 representative sea state conditions for each of the call areas, the Morro Bay and Humboldt Bay, I think we tried to include representative cases for situations when the turbines are feathered. So that is a type of extreme scenario that is already included as one of the sea states that we have identified that could happen with a certain, relatively noticeable frequency during the lifetime of the system. However, again, as Eli mentioned, we avoided focusing mostly on DLCs, which stands for design load conditions. Those design load conditions are meant for a structural design of the system to make sure that the system can survive under very extreme, severe conditions, and focusing only on those conditions would not be a reasonable approach for our system, because our system should be able to detect entanglement during the majority of the time when the offshore wind farm is operating.
Thanks very much. And so I guess to move to close out, I will, let's see, I guess just thank all 3 of you again, Maysam, Eli, and Greyson for presenting today, and thanks to everyone in the audience for your interest. If you have follow-up questions or would like additional information, feel free to reach out to us. We'll add or put contact emails in the chat in case there is interest to follow up. I'll note that in addition, we're planning to we have recorded this presentation, and we're planning to make the recording available as soon as we're able, likely sometime next week, as soon as we're able to complete the captioning and other things to make it accessible. And we'll post that to the Schatz Energy Research Center's YouTube channel, and we'll also make it available through the Pacific Offshore Wind Consortium, or POWC, website. So please look for that in those locations if you're interested in the recording. Our next webinar, as was mentioned earlier in the chat, is next Tuesday at 11 a.m., where there'll be a presentation about recommendations related to an environmental monitoring framework for offshore wind. This is based on work over the last couple of years that's been funded by the California Ocean Protection Council and led by the California Marine Sanctuary Foundation in collaboration with hundreds of scientists and others who have been involved in this effort to develop a statewide environmental monitoring framework for floating offshore wind development. That presentation will be next Tuesday, the 23rd of June, starting at 11 a.m. So for those who are interested, you can find additional information on the POWC website, including registration information. And I think that information is or links related to that webinar are also posted to the chat for those who are interested. And with that, I think that we can close for the day, and just look forward to next steps in this project, and we'll stay in touch and provide additional information as some of the other upcoming webinars that we mentioned in relation to this project are being scheduled. Thank you all, and good afternoon.